On Christmas Eve in 1945, as families across America gathered to celebrate the most joyous night of the year, a tragedy unfolded in the small Appalachian town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, that would haunt the nation for decades. 5 children vanished into the winter darkness, leaving behind a mystery so profound, so disturbing, that it challenges everything we understand about fire, death, and the lengths to which desperate people might go to exact revenge. This is the story of the Sodder children, a tale that begins with flames and ends with questions that may never be answered. The Sodder family home stood 2 miles north of Fayetteville, a 2-story timber frame house that had become a symbol of immigrant success in America. Inside its walls lived George and Jennie Sodder, along with 9 of their 10 children. Their oldest son, Joe, was away serving his country in World War II, stationed at an army base in North Carolina, unable to return home for the holidays. The family had gathered that Christmas Eve in 1945, celebrating what they hoped would be a return to peace and normalcy after years of global conflict. But normalcy was not what awaited the Sodder family that night. Instead, they would face a nightmare that would consume the rest of their lives, transforming them from a respected middle-class family into obsessed investigators of their own tragedy. The questions that emerged from the ashes of their home would spark one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a case that continues to perplex investigators, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts more than 7 decades later. To understand the mystery of what happened that Christmas Eve, we must first understand who the Sodders were and how they came to build their life in the hills of West Virginia. George Sodder was born Giorgio Sodu in 1895 in the town of Tula, Sardinia, an island off the coast of Italy. At the age of 13, in 1908, Giorgio made the long journey to America with an older brother. They arrived at Ellis Island, that gateway through which millions of immigrants passed in search of a better life. But George's brother had different plans. As soon as both boys cleared customs at Ellis Island, the older sibling immediately returned to Italy, leaving 13-year-old Giorgio alone in a strange country where he barely spoke the language. For the rest of his life, George would never speak much about why he left his homeland or why his brother abandoned him so quickly. This silence about his past would later fuel speculation about his life before America, with some suggesting he had connections to darker elements of Italian society. Young Giorgio, who would soon become known as George, found work on the Pennsylvania railroads. It was grueling labor for a teenage boy, carrying water and supplies to the workers who were building America's expanding rail network. But George was determined and ambitious. After a few years of railroad work, he moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where the coal industry was booming. He started as a driver, learning the ins and outs of transportation in the mountainous terrain. George's ambition drove him to start his own trucking company. He began by hauling fill dirt to construction sites, then expanded to freight, and eventually found his niche hauling coal from the region's many mines. The coal industry was king in West Virginia, and George's business prospered. He became known as a reliable, hard-working businessman who kept his word. One day, George walked into a local store in Smithers called the Music Box. Behind the counter was a young woman named Jennie Cipriani. Like George, Jennie had Italian roots. She had come to America from Italy as a toddler with her family. Her father owned the store, and Jennie helped run the family business. George and Jennie's courtship blossomed, and they married in 1922. The couple settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, drawn to the town because it had a substantial Italian immigrant community. They purchased a plot of land about 2 miles north of town and built their 2-story timber frame house. Between 1923 and 1943, George and Jennie had 10 children. Their names, in order of birth, were John, Joe, George Jr., Marion, who was also called Mary Ann, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, named after her mother, Betty, and finally Sylvia, born in 1942. The Sodder family became, in the words of a local magistrate, one of the most respected middle-class families around. George's trucking business continued to thrive, providing a comfortable living for his large family. The children attended school in Fayetteville, and the family was known for being close-knit and hard-working. They represented the American dream, immigrants who had come with nothing and built a prosperous life through determination and effort. But George Sodder was also known for something else: his strong opinions and his unwillingness to keep them to himself. This trait, admirable in some contexts, would have devastating consequences. The shadow of Mussolini. In the 1930s and 40s, Italy was under the control of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who led his country into an alliance with Nazi Germany. Mussolini's regime divided Italian immigrant communities around the world. Some Italian Americans supported Il Duce, seeing him as a strong leader who had brought order to Italy. Others, like George Sodder, saw him for what he truly was: a brutal dictator who had destroyed Italian democracy and led the nation into a disastrous war. George Sodder was vocally, even stridently, opposed to Mussolini and the fascist government. In the close-knit Italian community of Fayetteville, this put him at odds with some of his neighbors. Arguments would erupt at social gatherings, in businesses, at community events. George did not moderate his views to keep the peace. He spoke his mind, often alienating people who might otherwise have been friends. By 1943, Mussolini had been deposed and executed by Italian partisans as World War II drew to a close in Europe. But George's criticism of the late dictator had left hard feelings in the community. Some took his anti-Mussolini stance as an insult to Italy itself, to their heritage, to their identity as Italian Americans. It was in October of 1945, just 2 months before Christmas, that the first ominous warning came to the Sodder household. A life insurance salesman came to their door, attempting to sell George a policy. George listened to the pitch, but ultimately declined. He didn't feel he needed additional insurance, and that should have been the end of it. But the insurance salesman became irate at the rejection. His face twisted with anger as he pointed at George and issued a chilling threat. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was taken aback by the vehemence of the man's anger, but he didn't take the threat seriously. People said things in anger all the time. Besides, what could one angry insurance salesman do? George dismissed the incident and went on with his life. But that wasn't the only strange occurrence in the months leading up to Christmas. Another visitor came to the Sodder home, ostensibly seeking work. George showed him around, and the man wandered to the back of the house where the electrical system was located. He examined the fuse boxes, and then turned to George with a puzzling warning. "These are going to cause a fire someday." George was confused by this statement. He had recently had the entire house rewired when they installed a new electric stove. The local electric company had inspected the work and certified it as safe. There was no reason to think the electrical system posed any danger. George dismissed this warning as well, though later he would remember it with a chill. There were other unsettling signs. In the weeks before Christmas, George's older sons noticed something odd. A strange car was frequently parked along the main highway that ran through Fayetteville. The occupants would sit and watch as the younger Sodder children walked home from school. The car would be there in the afternoon, its passengers' eyes following the children as they made their way home. The boys mentioned it to their father, but again, what could be done? People parked along the highway all the time. Looking back, the Sodders would realize that the warnings had been there, that something had been building toward a terrible climax. But in the moment, with Christmas approaching and the war finally over, they pushed these concerns to the back of their minds. They had a holiday to celebrate, a family to care for, a life to live. Christmas Eve, 1945. December 24th, 1945, dawned cold and clear over Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder household buzzed with the excitement that only Christmas Eve can bring, especially to a house full of children. Marion, the oldest daughter at 19, had been working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville. She had saved money from her job and surprised 3 of her younger sisters, 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jennie, and 5-year-old Betty, with new toys as early Christmas presents. The younger children were overjoyed. They begged their mother to let them stay up past their usual bedtime to play with their new toys. Jennie Sodder, seeing the happiness in their faces and caught up in the spirit of the season, agreed. She told them they could stay up a little later, as long as 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis remembered to complete their evening chores first, putting the cows in and feeding the chickens. The older members of the family began retiring for the night around 10 o'clock. George and his 2 oldest sons, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., had spent a long day working at the family trucking business. They were exhausted and went to bed early. Jennie took 3-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her, tucking the toddler into the crib in the master bedroom. The house settled into a peaceful quiet. Marion fell asleep on the couch downstairs. The younger children eventually finished playing with their toys. Maurice and Louis went outside to complete their chores, tending to the animals in the cold December night. Then they came back in, and the 5 younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, made their way upstairs to the 2 bedrooms at the end of the hallway where they slept. What happened next would forever shatter the Sodder family and create a mystery that endures to this day. The night the house burned. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, technically now Christmas Day, Jennie Sodder was awakened by the ringing of the telephone. She got out of bed, careful not to wake little Sylvia, and went downstairs to answer it. She picked up the receiver and heard the voice of a woman she didn't recognize, asking for someone Jennie didn't know. "You have the wrong number," Jennie said. As she was about to hang up, she heard something that struck her as odd. In the background, she could hear the sound of clinking glasses and laughter, as if the caller was at a party. Then she heard it, a strange, unsettling laugh from the woman on the line. It wasn't the normal laugh of someone who had made a mistake. It was odd, almost sinister. Some later reports would describe it as a cackling laugh. Jennie hung up and began to walk back upstairs. As she passed through the living room, she noticed something unusual. The Christmas tree lights were still on, as were several other lights in the downstairs rooms. This was strange, because the children always turned off the lights before going to bed, but perhaps in their excitement over the new toys, they had forgotten. Jennie didn't think much more of it and returned to bed. She drifted back to sleep, but was awakened again about half an hour later, around 1 o'clock in the morning. This time, she heard a loud noise, a hard thud on the roof of the house, followed by what sounded like something rolling across the roofing material, and then falling off. She listened for a moment, heard nothing more, and went back to sleep. Another 30 minutes passed. Then Jennie woke to a smell that sent immediate terror through her body: smoke. She bolted upright and saw that George's office, a room adjacent to their bedroom, was engulfed in flames. The fire was concentrated around the telephone line and the fuse box. Jennie screamed for George, jolting him awake. George leaped from the bed and took immediate stock of the situation. The fire had already spread through the downstairs. The living room, dining room, kitchen, office, and their bedroom were all either on fire or filling with smoke. They needed to get everyone out immediately. George grabbed Sylvia from her crib. The 3-year-old was crying, terrified by the smoke and her parents' panic. George handed her to Jennie and shouted for the older children. Marion woke from where she had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, groggy and confused. John and George Jr., sleeping in the upstairs bedroom at the opposite end of the hall from the younger children, were awakened by their father's shouts. They ran for the stairs, their hair singeing from the heat as they rushed past the flames. George, Jennie, Marion, John, George Jr., and little Sylvia made it outside into the frigid December night. They stood in the snow, inadequately dressed for the cold, and George did a quick mental count. 6 of them had made it out. But where were the others? Where were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty? George's mind raced. The 5 younger children must still be in their bedrooms at the opposite end of the upstairs hallway. The staircase that led to their rooms was now engulfed in flames, making that route impossible. But there had to be another way. There had to be. George's ladder. He always kept a ladder leaning against the exterior wall of the house, positioned near the upstairs windows for maintenance work. He could use it to climb up and get to the children's rooms from outside. George ran around the house to where the ladder should be. It wasn't there. George's heart pounded as he searched the area. The ladder was always in the same spot. Always. But it was gone. Vanished in the one moment when he needed it most. There was no time to search for it. He needed another solution. His trucks. George ran to his 2 coal trucks, the vehicles he used for his business. If he couldn't use a ladder, he would drive a truck up next to the house and climb onto its roof to reach the second-story windows. He jumped into the first truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. George's panic grew. These trucks had been working perfectly earlier that day. He had driven them. There was no reason they shouldn't start. He jumped out and ran to the second truck, turned its key. Nothing again. It wouldn't start either. George looked around desperately. Near the house were several barrels that collected rainwater. He could fill buckets and try to fight the fire, or at least slow it down long enough to reach the children. He ran to the closest barrel and plunged a bucket into it. The water was frozen solid. It was a cold December night, cold enough to freeze water through, but George hadn't even thought about it. Now he stood there, unable to reach his children, unable to even try to fight the fire that was consuming his home. Inside that inferno were 5 of his children, and there was nothing he could do. Marion, shivering in the snow, told her mother she would run to the neighbors to call the fire department. She sprinted through the darkness to the nearest neighbor's house and pounded on the door. When they answered, she asked to use their phone to call for help. She picked up the receiver. The phone was dead. No dial tone, nothing. Marion ran to another neighbor's house. Their phone didn't work either. The neighbor, understanding the desperation of the situation, got into his vehicle and drove into town to find Fire Chief F.J. Maurice. This was around 1 in the morning on Christmas. Many people were still awake, celebrating the holiday. The neighbor found Chief Maurice and told him about the fire. Chief Maurice began making phone calls. The Fayetteville Fire Department, like many small-town departments of that era, was staffed by volunteers. The system for alerting them was a call tree. One firefighter would call another, who would call another, and so on. But it was Christmas morning. Many of the firefighters had been drinking, celebrating with their families. Some didn't answer their phones. Others couldn't be reached. Meanwhile, the Sodder family stood in the snow and watched their house burn. George's arm was bleeding badly. He had broken a window trying to get back inside, cutting a deep gash. They couldn't see through the smoke and flames to know if the children had somehow escaped. They called out their names, but there was no response, no sound except the roar and crack of the fire consuming their home. The fire burned hot and fast. The 2-story timber frame house was like kindling. Within 45 minutes of when Jennie first smelled smoke, the entire structure had collapsed into the basement, leaving nothing but a pile of smoking ash and rubble. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 7 hours after the fire began, the Fayetteville Fire Department finally arrived. Chief F.J. Maurice later explained that the delay was due to several factors. It was Christmas, many firefighters were unavailable, and he himself couldn't drive the fire truck, requiring him to wait until someone who could drive showed up. By the time the firefighters arrived, there was nothing left to save. The house was gone, and 5 children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jennie, and 5-year-old Betty, were presumed to be somewhere in that pile of ash. The investigation, more questions than answers. With dawn came the grim task of searching through the ruins of the Sodder home. George, Jennie, and the surviving children stood by, numb with grief and shock, as Fire Chief Maurice and his crew sifted through the debris in the basement where the house had collapsed. They were looking for what everyone assumed they would find: the remains of 5 children. But as the hours passed, something strange became apparent. They weren't finding anything. No bones, no teeth, no recognizable remains. Chief Maurice told the Sodders that they had found a few small bones and pieces of what might have been internal organs, but nothing conclusive. The Sodders were never formally told about even these finds, and no remains were shown to the family. By 10 o'clock that morning, Chief Maurice delivered his assessment to George and Jennie. The fire must have been so hot that it completely cremated the children's bodies, burning them entirely to ash. There was nothing left to recover, nothing left to bury. George and Jennie were devastated, but in their grief, they didn't immediately question this explanation. They had lost 5 of their children. Their home was gone. Their lives had been shattered. 4 days later, unable to bear looking at the ruins any longer, George made a decision. He brought in a bulldozer and covered the entire site with 5 feet of dirt, intending to create a memorial garden for the children they had lost. The local coroner convened an inquest the day after the fire. The jury, made up of local residents, quickly reached a conclusion. The 5 children had died in the fire. The cause of the fire was determined to be faulty wiring. The Sodders were issued 5 death certificates on December 30th, 1945. The certificates listed the cause of death as fire or suffocation. The case appeared to be closed. A terrible tragedy, to be sure, but a straightforward one. A house fire caused by electrical problems, a family unable to save all of their children. It happened. The Sodders would grieve, rebuild, and eventually move forward with their lives. But that's not what happened. Because as George and Jennie began to emerge from their initial shock and grief, they started to notice things that didn't add up. Small details that, when put together, painted a very different picture from the official story. The first thing that bothered Jennie was the assertion that the fire had completely cremated the children. She was an intelligent woman, and that explanation didn't make sense to her. She went to the local crematorium and spoke with the staff there. They told her that in order to completely reduce a human body to ash, it required burning at temperatures of at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 hours. Even then, bone fragments would remain. The Sodder house fire had burned for only 45 minutes to an hour, and the temperature of a house fire, while certainly hot enough to be deadly, was nowhere near the temperatures achieved in a crematorium. Jennie began conducting her own experiments, burning animal bones to see what remained. No matter how hot the fire or how long it burned, she always found bone fragments afterward. If the fire had consumed the children, there should have been something left. Skeletal remains, teeth, something. But the firefighters claimed to have found virtually nothing. How was that possible? The Sodders also found it suspicious that household items had survived the fire in recognizable form. appliances from the kitchen, fragments of the tin roof, various metal objects. All had been found in the ashes, damaged but identifiable. If these items could survive the fire intact enough to be recognized, how could 5 children have been reduced to nothing? Then there were the other strange circumstances they began to remember. George recalled the warning from the insurance salesman just 2 months earlier. Your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. At the time, it had seemed like an angry outburst. Now it seemed like a prophecy, or a plan. They remembered the man who had warned them about the fuse boxes causing a fire, even though the electrical work had been recently inspected and certified as safe. They remembered the strange car that had been watching the younger children walk home from school in the weeks before Christmas. And they remembered that odd phone call to Jennie just before the fire, the woman asking for someone they didn't know, the sound of a party in the background, that strange cackling laugh. Had that been a signal? A way to ensure that Jennie and George were awake before the fire started? George began investigating the fire's cause himself. If the fire had been electrical, as the official report stated, then the power should have gone out when the wiring failed. But Jennie had seen the Christmas tree lights still on after waking from the phone call. The lights downstairs had been on during the early stages of the fire. How could that be if an electrical failure had started the blaze? Then came another disturbing discovery. The Sodders found the ladder that had been missing on the night of the fire. It was at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet from the house. It hadn't simply been misplaced or blown away by wind. Someone had deliberately moved it and hidden it. A telephone repairman came to restore service to the Sodder property. He examined the phone lines and made a shocking statement. The line hadn't been burned through in the fire. It had been cut. Someone had climbed the telephone pole, reached 2 feet out from the pole, and deliberately severed the line. This explained why the neighbors' phones hadn't worked when Marion tried to call for help. Whoever cut the Sodders' line had also cut the neighbors' connections. George's trucks, which had mysteriously failed to start on the night of the fire, were examined. Both were found to have been tampered with, though the exact nature of the sabotage was never fully documented. The trucks worked fine after the fire. And then there was the man who had been seen near the Sodder property on the night of the fire. A witness came forward and identified him as someone who had been stealing a block and tackle, a device used for removing car engines, from the Sodders' property. The man was arrested and confessed to the theft. He claimed he had cut what he thought was a power line because he believed it would create a diversion while he stole the equipment, not realizing it was a telephone line. However, this confession didn't fully explain all the other suspicious circumstances. The arson theory. As the evidence accumulated, George and Jennie became convinced of something that law enforcement seemed reluctant to consider. Their house had been deliberately set on fire. The fire was arson, intended to kill their entire family, or perhaps to create confusion while something else happened. Several witnesses came forward with information that supported this theory. A bus driver who had passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve reported seeing something disturbing. People throwing what he described as balls of fire at the Sodder house. These could have been Molotov cocktails or some other type of incendiary device. Several months after the fire, when the snow melted, 3-year-old Sylvia made a discovery in the brush near where the house had stood. She found a small, hard, dark green rubber ball-like object. George examined it and felt a chill run through him. He had served in World War I and had seen military equipment. To him, the object looked exactly like a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade or incendiary device used in combat. He remembered Jennie describing the loud thump on the roof, followed by a rolling sound just before the fire started. Had someone thrown an incendiary device onto the roof of their house? The family later claimed that, contrary to Fire Chief Maurice's conclusion, that the fire started in the electrical system, the fire had actually started on the roof. By the time anyone could investigate this claim thoroughly, however, the evidence had been destroyed. Everything pointed to a deliberate attack. But if the fire had been set intentionally, who was responsible? And more importantly, what had happened to the 5 children? George and Jennie refused to believe their children had died in the fire. They couldn't believe it. And soon, evidence began to emerge that suggested the children might still be alive. The sightings. In the days, weeks, and months following the fire, multiple people came forward claiming to have seen the 5 Sodder children. If even one of these sightings was genuine, it would mean the children had somehow survived or been taken before the fire consumed the house. The first sighting came from a woman who lived along the route from the Sodder house toward Fayetteville. She reported that on the night of the fire, while the house was still burning, she saw the 5 Sodder children peering out from inside a passing car. She was certain of what she had seen: 5 children, matching the descriptions of the missing Sodders, in a car that was driving away from the scene of the fire, even as flames engulfed the house. The next morning, Christmas morning, 1945, a woman working at a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, about 50 miles west, reported an unusual encounter. A group had come in for breakfast, 4 or 5 children accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. The children looked exactly like the Sodder children. The woman tried to speak to the children in a friendly manner, but one of the men immediately intervened. He looked at her with what she described as hostility, turned to his companions, and began speaking rapidly in Italian. The entire group stopped talking to the woman, giving her the cold shoulder. They left early the next morning. The woman noted that the car had a Florida license plate. About a week after the fire, another witness came forward. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, reported that the 5 Sodder children had checked into her establishment. She stated that the children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. When she tried to interact with the children, the adults became hostile and prevented any conversation. She claimed to remember the incident clearly because of how unusual it was: 5 children who seemed uncomfortable and adults who were overtly hostile to any friendly overtures. Over the years, more sightings would trickle in. Someone claimed to have seen the children in a home in Smithers. Another report placed them at a ballet class in New York City. There were sightings in Florida, in Texas, in various locations around the country. George would follow up on many of these leads personally, traveling to wherever the children had allegedly been seen. Each time, the trail would go cold. Either the children were gone by the time he arrived, or the witness was mistaken, or there simply wasn't enough information to follow up. But the most compelling evidence wouldn't arrive until more than 20 years after the fire, in 1967. Jennie went to retrieve the mail one day and found an envelope addressed solely to her. There was no return address, and the postmark indicated it had been sent from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his late 20s or early 30s, along with a cryptic message written on the back: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Elil boys, A90132 or 35. George and Jennie studied the photograph intensely. The man in the picture had dark curly hair and dark brown eyes. He had a straight, strong nose and an upward tilt to his left eyebrow. These were all features that Louis had possessed as a child. If Louis had survived and was now in his 30s, this was exactly what George and Jennie imagined he would look like. The message was puzzling. Louis Sodder identified the person in the photograph. I love brother Frankie suggested this was a message from Louis to a brother named Frank. But the Sodders didn't have a son named Frank. However, Jennie's maiden name was Cipriani, and she had a brother named Frank. Could Louis be with Jennie's brother? Or did Frankie refer to someone else? "Ilil boys" was harder to interpret. Some thought it might be a corruption of little boys. Others suggested it could be an acronym or code of some kind. The numbers A90132 or 35 were equally mysterious. Some researchers noted that if you treated these as Italian postal codes, 90135 corresponded to an area in Palermo, Sicily, a city notoriously associated with the Sicilian Mafia. George and Jennie were convinced that the photograph was genuinely from Louis. They hired yet another private investigator and sent him to Central City, Kentucky, to track down whoever had sent the photograph. The investigator left with the Sodders' money and all the information about the case. He was never seen or heard from again. The private investigator had simply vanished, taking the Sodders' money and their best lead with him. George and Jennie were devastated but not defeated. They added the photograph to their billboard, showing the picture alongside Louis's childhood photo. They still believed their son was out there somewhere. The Sodders feared that if they revealed too much information about the photograph or its origin, it might put Louis in danger. So they were careful about what details they made public. But privately, they never stopped hoping that Louis, and perhaps his siblings, would one day find a way to contact them. The Mafia theory. As George and Jennie pieced together the evidence and considered the various threats and warnings they had received, a theory began to form. It was a theory that would dominate speculation about the case for decades. The Sodder children had been kidnapped by the Sicilian Mafia as revenge for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. The theory had several components. First, there was George's vocal opposition to the Italian dictator. In the Italian immigrant community of Fayetteville, this had made him enemies. Some members of that community had deep ties to Italy and still harbored sympathies for the fascist regime, even after Mussolini's fall. Second, there were the direct threats. The insurance salesman's ominous warning that the house would burn and the children would be destroyed, explicitly connecting it to George's dirty remarks about Mussolini, seemed too specific to be coincidence. The fact that this same man had served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident only deepened suspicions of a conspiracy. Third, there was the methodology of the attack. If the goal had been simply to kill the Sodder family, the arsonists could have barred the doors or done something to ensure no one escaped. Instead, the fire seemed designed to create confusion. The phone call to Jennie, the timing of the incendiary device on the roof, the cutting of the phone lines, the removal of the ladder, the sabotaging of the trucks. All of it suggested a plan to confuse and distract George and Jennie while something else happened. That something else, according to the theory, was the kidnapping of the 5 youngest children. Someone who knew the family, who knew the layout of the house, could have entered through an unlocked door. They could have told the children there was a fire and they needed to leave immediately to come with them to safety. The children, terrified and confused, would have obeyed an adult they recognized or who seemed to be there to help them. The children could have been taken to a waiting vehicle and driven away while the fire consumed the house and the family's attention. The witness who saw children in a car driving away from the fire would support this scenario. The subsequent sightings at the tourist stop and the Charleston Hotel, all involving Italian-speaking adults who became hostile when anyone tried to interact with the children, suggested the children had been taken by people connected to the Italian community, possibly the Mafia. But why take the children at all? Why not simply kill the entire family if revenge was the motive? Several possibilities existed. Perhaps the kidnapping was intended to be a fate worse than death for George, forcing him to live the rest of his life, not knowing what happened to his children, wondering if they were alive and suffering somewhere. Perhaps the children were intended for human trafficking, to be sold to families willing to pay for them. Or perhaps they were taken to Italy, to be raised by Mafia families there, their identities erased and their memories of their real family eventually fading. The photograph, supposedly from Lewis in 1967, would support the theory that at least some of the children had survived and were living elsewhere under assumed names. The reference to Sicily in the coded message, the fact that the adults who were seen with the children spoke Italian, all of it pointed towards some organized criminal conspiracy with connections to Italy. However, it's important to note that this mafia theory, while compelling and widely discussed, has never been proven. No direct evidence has ever emerged linking the Sicilian Mafia or any other criminal organization to the disappearance of the Sodder children. The theory remains speculation, one possible explanation among several for what happened that Christmas Eve. The billboard and the eternal search. By 1947, George and Jennie Sodder had given up hope that local authorities would help them find their children. They had written to the FBI, hoping the federal government would investigate what they believed was a kidnapping. J. Edgar Hoover himself responded to their letter, but his response was not encouraging. Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. Hoover added that FBI agents would assist if local authorities requested their help, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined to do so. The case, as far as they were concerned, was closed. 5 children had died in a house fire caused by faulty wiring. There was nothing more to investigate. In 1949, George hired a pathologist to conduct an excavation of the site where the house had stood. George had covered it with dirt immediately after the fire, but now he wanted to search more thoroughly for any remains. The excavation uncovered a small portion of human vertebrae, 4 vertebrae to be exact. The Sodders were hopeful that this might finally provide concrete evidence about what had happened. The vertebrae were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report that came back was both confusing and disturbing. According to the Smithsonian pathologists, the vertebrae all belonged to a single individual, likely a male between the ages of 16 and 22. The bones showed no evidence of having been exposed to fire. The report noted that it was very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful excavation of the basement of the house. Given the relatively short time the fire burned, the report concluded, one would expect to find the full skeletons of the 5 children, rather than only 4 vertebrae. The pathologists added that the bones had most likely been in the supply of dirt that George had used to fill in the basement when creating his memorial. In other words, the vertebrae probably had nothing to do with the fire at all. They belonged to someone else entirely and had been accidentally mixed in with the dirt. The Smithsonian's findings prompted 2 hearings at the state capitol in Charleston, but the outcome was not what the Sodders hoped for. Governor Oki L. Pattison and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the family that their search was hopeless and officially declared the case closed at the state level. Undeterred, George and Jennie decided to take matters into their own hands. In 1952, they took a dramatic step. They erected a large billboard at the site where their house had once stood. The billboard was positioned along State Route 16, previously U.S. Route 19, where thousands of travelers would pass by and see it. The billboard was striking and heartbreaking. It featured photographs of all 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. Their faces looked out at eye level for anyone viewing the billboard on foot. The sign included a description of what had happened on Christmas Eve 1945, along with the question that haunted George and Jennie. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? The billboard also offered a reward for information. Initially, the reward was $5,000, a substantial sum in the 1950s. The Sodders eventually increased it to $10,000, but they never had to pay out the reward because no one ever provided information that led to finding the children. After receiving the photograph supposedly from Louis in 1967, the Sodders updated the billboard to include this image. They replaced Louis's childhood photo with the picture of the young man, hoping that someone might recognize him and come forward with information. The billboard stood for nearly 4 decades. It became a landmark along Route 16, a constant reminder of the tragedy and the mystery. Travelers would pull over to read the story. Local residents would drive past it regularly, the faces of the 5 children becoming familiar even to those who hadn't been alive when the fire occurred. For older residents of Fayetteville, the billboard was a painful reminder of a tragedy that had shocked their community. For younger generations, it was an introduction to one of the most perplexing mysteries in American history. George and Jennie never stopped searching for their children. George hired multiple private investigators over the years, following every lead, no matter how tenuous. When a woman in St. Louis wrote claiming that Martha was in a convent there, George traveled to the city to investigate, only to be disappointed. When someone in Texas claimed to have overheard a conversation about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia, George made the trip. When one of Jennie's relatives in Florida was reported to have children who looked similar to the Sodders, George went there too, asking the relative to prove the children were actually his own. In 1967, the same year the photograph supposedly from Louis arrived, the Sodders received another tantalizing tip. A woman in Houston, Texas, wrote to say that she had encountered 2 men in a bar who claimed to be the missing Sodder brothers. One of them, according to the woman, had confessed his true identity after a night of drinking. George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, immediately traveled to Houston. With the help of local police, they tracked down the 2 men the woman had indicated. But when confronted, both men denied being the missing Sodder children. They sent George and Grover away. George never fully believed their denials, however. Doubts about that encounter lingered in his mind for the rest of his life. What if those men really had been his sons, but were too afraid to acknowledge it? What if they were being threatened or controlled by someone? George would never know for sure. George Sodder died in 1969, 24 years after the fire. He died without ever learning the fate of his children. Those who knew him said that the mystery consumed him until his final days. He had pursued every lead, spent a fortune on private investigators, traveled countless miles chasing hope, and always finding disappointment. The question of what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty haunted him through 2.5 decades, and he took that question with him to his grave. Jennie Sodder outlived her husband by 20 years. After George's death, she became even more reclusive. She erected a fence around the property and began adding rooms to the house they had built to replace the one that burned. Some said she was building walls between herself and the outside world, creating a fortress against the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. From the day of the fire until her death, Jennie wore black in mourning. She tended the memorial garden that George had created at the site of the fire, caring for the flowers that grew over the spot where her children had disappeared. She continued to hope that the mystery would be solved, that someone would come forward with information, that she might see her children again before she died. Jennie Sodder passed away in 1989 at the age of 87. Like her husband, she died without answers. Shortly after her death, the surviving Sodder children took down the weathered billboard that had stood along Route 16 for nearly 4 decades. It was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter, though the mystery itself remained as open and unresolved as ever. The surviving siblings. 4 of the Sodder children who escaped the fire on Christmas Eve 1945 lived to adulthood: John, George Jr., Marion, and Sylvia. Their brother Joe, who had been away in the army that night, also survived. Each of them carried the trauma of that night and the mystery of their siblings' disappearance for the rest of their lives. John Sodder, the oldest, was 23 at the time of the fire. He later married a woman named Margaret, and they had a family of their own. John rarely spoke about the night of the fire. His family reported that he believed they should accept what happened and move on with their lives, though whether this reflected his true feelings or was simply his way of coping with trauma is unknown. John passed away sometime after his father, though the exact date is not widely recorded. George Jr. was 16 on the night of the fire. Like his brother John, he had been sleeping in the upstairs bedroom at the opposite end of the hall from the younger children. He and John managed to escape by running down the stairs, their hair singeing in the heat. George Jr. later married a woman named Elsie. He supported his parents' investigation, but, like John, didn't speak publicly about the case very often. He passed away before his mother. Marion Sodder, who went by Mary Ann, was 19 at the time of the fire. She had been the one to buy Christmas presents for her younger sisters, the toys they were so excited about that they stayed up late to play with them. Marion had been sleeping on the couch downstairs when the fire started. She was the one who ran to the neighbors trying to call for help, only to find the phones weren't working. She later married a man named Robert Crowder. Marion passed away before her mother, having lived with the knowledge that her last gift to her sisters might have kept them up late enough to make them more vulnerable. Joe Sodder had been serving in the Army on Christmas Eve 1945, stationed at a base in North Carolina. He had been discharged from the Army just one day before the fire, but he hadn't been able to make it home for Christmas. Some have speculated about what might have been different if Joe had been home that night. Would he have been able to help his father save the younger children? Or would he have simply become a sixth missing child? Joe later married a woman named Louise and had a family. Like his siblings, he supported his parents' search for answers. He passed away before his mother. And then there was Sylvia, the youngest. She had been only 3 years old on the night of the fire, sleeping in a crib in her parents' bedroom. She was the first to be saved when George grabbed her as he and Jennie fled their burning bedroom. Sylvia's first memory, she would later recall, was of that terrible night, the smoke, the flames, the screaming, and most vividly, the sight of her father's arm bleeding where he had cut it, trying to break back into the house. Sylvia Sodder married Grover Paxton, whom she met while attending West Virginia Institute of Technology. She joked that her most important achievement in college was earning her Mrs. degree. But Sylvia was far more than that joke suggested. She became a devoted wife and mother, creating a warm and loving home for her own children. She was known for her cooking, her gardening, her infectious laugh, and her wonderful sense of humor. But Sylvia never forgot her missing siblings, and she never believed they had died in the fire. Of all the surviving Sodder children, Sylvia was the most outspoken about her conviction that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty had been taken and were possibly still alive somewhere. She attended to the case closely, helping her parents with their investigation, and later continuing the search on her own. After her parents' deaths, Sylvia worked with her own children to keep the case in the public eye. In the 21st century, this meant utilizing new tools and platforms. Sylvia and her family engaged with true crime forums online, participated in discussions on websites dedicated to cold cases, and responded to inquiries from journalists, authors, and documentarians interested in the case. Sylvia's daughter, Jennie Henthorne, named after Sylvia's mother and one of the missing Sodder children, became a particular advocate for keeping the case alive. Jennie Henthorne has given numerous interviews over the years, sharing her grandmother's story and her mother's unwavering belief that the missing children survived. She has provided materials to researchers, including photographs, documents, and family stories that have been essential for anyone trying to understand what happened. In a 2013 interview with the Charleston Gazette-Mail newspaper, Sylvia, then 71 years old, reflected on her life growing up as a Sodder child. "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," she recalled. She spoke about the long conversations she would have with her father late at night, discussing what might have happened to her siblings. "I experienced their grief for a long time," she said. Sylvia promised her parents that she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could to find answers. She kept that promise for the rest of her life. Sylvia Sodder Paxton passed away on April 21, 2021, at the age of 79, after a long illness. Her obituary honored her as a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother. It mentioned her love of cooking, her talent for gardening, and her wonderful sense of humor. And it included a poignant note about her 5 missing siblings. 5 other siblings were unable to be located following a fire that occurred in December 1945 in their Fayetteville home: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. With Sylvia's death, all of the Sodder siblings who survived the fire have now passed away. If any of the 5 missing children somehow survived and were still alive in 2021, they would have been in their 80s or 90s. Maurice, the oldest of the 5, would have been 90 years old. Betty, the youngest, would have been 81. Modern analysis and theories. More than 7 decades after the Sodder children vanished on Christmas Eve 1945, the case continues to fascinate researchers, investigators, and true crime enthusiasts. With the passage of time and advances in forensic science and investigative techniques, modern analysts have re-examined the evidence and developed new theories about what might have happened. One persistent theory is that the children did, in fact, die in the fire, despite the lack of remains. Proponents of this theory point out that house fires can be unpredictable, and the Sodder fire may have burned hotter or longer in certain areas than the family realized. They suggest that the children's remains might have been completely consumed or scattered in ways that made them impossible to find during the searches that were conducted. This theory must account for several problems, however. Multiple fire and cremation experts have stated that it would be virtually impossible for a house fire that burned for less than an hour to completely consume 5 bodies, particularly 5 children's bodies, leaving no bones or teeth behind. The temperature would need to be sustained at levels far higher than a typical house fire achieves, and for much longer than 45 minutes. Moreover, household items were found in the rubble in recognizable form. If a washing machine and fragments of tin roofing could survive the fire identifiable enough to know what they were, it seems highly unlikely that 5 complete human bodies would leave no trace whatsoever. Another theory suggests that the children died in the fire, but their remains were removed before the official search began. This would explain both the lack of bones in the debris and the certainty with which the Sodders believed their children had been taken. According to this theory, someone involved in the arson removed the bodies to hide evidence of murder or to create confusion about what had actually happened. This theory has its own complications. Who would have removed the bodies, and when? The fire burned throughout the early morning hours, and George and Jennie were present the entire time. The fire department arrived 7 hours after the fire began, but by then it was daylight, and the Sodders were still there. When could someone have accessed the site to remove remains without being seen? A third theory, and perhaps the most disturbing, is that the children were never in the house when it burned. According to this theory, someone gained access to the house, convinced or forced the 5 younger children to leave with them, and then set the fire to cover the kidnapping and create confusion. The children were taken while the fire raged, driven away to destinations unknown. This theory aligns with several pieces of evidence. The witness who saw children matching the Sodders' description in a car driving away from the fire, the subsequent sightings at the tourist stop and hotel, the photograph supposedly from Louis decades later. It would explain why no remains were ever found. There were no remains to find because the children weren't in the house when it burned. However, this theory requires accepting that someone managed to wake 5 sleeping children, ages 5 through 14, convince them to leave their beds in the middle of the night, get them out of the house without anyone noticing, and drive away with them, all while successfully staging what appeared to be a deadly house fire. It's a complex scenario requiring considerable planning and coordination. Some researchers have suggested that perhaps the children didn't all leave together. Maybe some died in the fire while others were taken, or maybe the younger ones were taken while the older ones died trying to escape. But this doesn't align with the eyewitness accounts, which describe seeing all 5 children together after the fire. The Mafia revenge theory remains popular in speculation about the case, but it too has problems. While George's anti-Mussolini stance did anger some members of the Italian immigrant community, there's no documented evidence of Mafia involvement in Fayetteville at that time, nor any direct evidence linking organized crime to the fire or the disappearance. The insurance salesman's threat, while chilling in retrospect, could have been nothing more than an angry outburst from someone who didn't like George. The fact that he was on the coroner's jury is suspicious, but not necessarily proof of a conspiracy. In a small town, the same people tend to serve on juries, and it's not unusual for people to serve even when they have some connection to those involved. A more mundane explanation might be that someone with a personal grudge against George, perhaps related to business dealings rather than political differences, decided to harm him by destroying his home. The fire could have been set purely as arson, without any intent to harm the children, and the children might have perished in a blaze that was meant only to destroy property. As for the sightings of the children after the fire, skeptics point out that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, especially when people are looking for something they want to see. In the aftermath of such a publicized tragedy, people might have convinced themselves they saw the Sodder children when they had actually seen other children who resembled them. The human mind has a powerful ability to find patterns and make connections, even when those connections don't actually exist. The photograph supposedly from Louis in 1967 is particularly troubling for skeptics to explain away. If it was a hoax, it was a particularly cruel one. But if it was genuine, why did the private investigator disappear when sent to follow up? Was he in on some conspiracy, or did he simply take the Sodders' money and run, never intending to conduct any real investigation? One area where modern forensic science might have helped is DNA analysis. If any tissue samples, bones, or other biological material from the fire scene had been preserved, DNA testing could potentially have determined whether any of it belonged to the missing children. However, no such samples appear to have been saved. The few bone fragments that were found were sent to the Smithsonian and analyzed using the technology available in the late 1940s. What happened to those samples after the analysis is unknown, but they were never subjected to DNA testing. Similarly, if the photograph supposedly showing an adult Louis was authentic, modern facial recognition technology and age progression software might be able to make a more definitive determination about whether the person in the photo could actually be Louis Sodder as an adult. But the original photograph's whereabouts are unknown, and only copies exist, which limits what modern technology can reveal. The legacy of the Sodder children. The disappearance of the Sodder children has left a lasting mark on American true crime history and on the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The case has been featured in countless books, articles, documentaries, and television programs. It was the subject of a segment on the popular television series Unsolved Mysteries. It has been discussed on true crime podcasts, analyzed on internet forums, and researched by both professional investigators and amateur sleuths. For decades, anyone driving along Route 16 near Fayetteville would pass the Sodder billboard and see the faces of those 5 children looking out at them, a haunting reminder of a mystery never solved. Even after the billboard came down in 1989, the case remained well known in the area. Local residents could tell you the story. The site where the Sodder house once stood became, in its own way, a landmark. Today, a different house stands where the Sodder home once was. Life goes on, as it always does. But the memory of what happened there on Christmas Eve 1945 endures. The case has become emblematic of certain themes that resonate deeply with the public. There's the ultimate parental nightmare, the loss of children in circumstances that make no sense, that leave no answers, no closure, no peace. There's the image of George and Jennie Sodder spending the rest of their lives searching, never giving up hope, never accepting the official explanations that seemed so inadequate. Their billboard along Route 16 became a symbol of a family's refusal to let go, their determination to find truth even when everyone else had moved on. There's also the unsettling suggestion of conspiracy, of a small town where things didn't add up, where perhaps people in positions of authority weren't telling the whole truth. The insurance salesman on the coroner's jury, the fire chief who claimed to have found a heart in the ashes, but then it turned out to be beef liver, the private investigator who vanished after taking the family's money. All of it feeds into the sense that something more was happening than a simple house fire, that there were forces at work the Sodders were never able to fully uncover. For some, the Sodder case represents the limits of what we can know. Despite the family's decades of investigation, despite all the attention the case has received, despite the theories and speculation and analysis, we still don't know with certainty what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder. We may never know. Some mysteries, it seems, are destined to remain forever unsolved. The evidence in the basement. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Sodder children case is what was actually found, or more accurately, what wasn't found, in the basement of the burned house. The official position was that the fire completely cremated the children's bodies. But let's examine this claim more carefully, using information that has come to light over the years. When the Fayetteville Fire Department conducted its search on Christmas Day, 1945, they spent only a few hours sifting through the debris. By all accounts, this was a cursory search at best. They were looking for bodies or remains of bodies, expecting to find something. Instead, they found almost nothing that could definitively be identified as human remains. Fire Chief Maurice initially told the Sodders that no bones had been found, suggesting the fire had been hot enough to cremate the bodies completely. This explanation should have been questioned more vigorously at the time. The Fayetteville Fire Department, like most small-town fire departments of that era, would have had limited experience with fatal fires. Their expertise in determining what should or shouldn't remain after a fire would have been minimal. Later, it emerged that Fire Chief Maurice had secretly told a local minister that he had actually found a heart in the ashes of the house. Rather than reporting this to the authorities or to the Sodders, Maurice claimed he had taken the heart, placed it in a box, and buried it. This story was eventually investigated when a private detective hired by the Sodders heard about it. The box was dug up and its contents examined by a funeral director. The object in the box was not a human heart. It was fresh beef liver that showed no signs of having been in a fire. Why Fire Chief Maurice would have done this remains a mystery. Was he trying to provide false closure to the grieving family? Was he trying to hide something? Or was the entire story fabricated? The vertebrae that were discovered in the 1949 excavation added another layer of confusion rather than providing answers. The Smithsonian analysis indicated they belonged to someone approximately 16 to 22 years old, which would have made Maurice, the oldest of the missing children at age 14, an unlikely match, though the report acknowledged it was possible, although not probable, that a 14-year-old might show skeletal maturation consistent with a slightly older age. More importantly, the vertebrae showed no evidence of having been exposed to fire. If they had been in the basement when the house burned, they should have shown some heat damage, some charring, some indication that they had been subjected to extreme temperatures. Instead, they appeared to have been in the dirt that was used to fill in the site, suggesting they came from elsewhere entirely. Perhaps from a cemetery, perhaps from a medical school specimen, perhaps from any number of other sources. The absence of any other bones, no ribs, no skull fragments, no pelvises, no femurs, no teeth, nothing else at all, is perhaps the most telling evidence that something other than a simple fire death occurred. Even in crematorium fires that burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours or more, bone fragments remain. Teeth, which are the most durable part of the human body, virtually always survive fires. The enamel on teeth can withstand temperatures that would destroy bone. Yet, in the Sodder house basement, nothing conclusive was found. The floor of the basement was concrete. When the house collapsed, the debris fell onto this concrete base. If 5 children had been in the house when it burned, there should have been something. Some teeth, some bone fragments, something to indicate that 5 human beings had been there. Various household items survived the fire in recognizable condition. The family's washing machine was found, damaged but identifiable. Fragments of the tin roof were recovered. Various metal objects and appliances were pulled from the rubble, burned and warped, but still recognizable for what they were. How could these items survive while 5 entire bodies disappeared without a trace? Forensic analysis, fire and remains. To understand why the absence of remains is so significant, it's important to understand how fire affects human bodies and what is required to reduce a body to ash. This is unpleasant to discuss, but it's crucial to understanding why the Sodders refused to believe their children died in the fire. When a human body is exposed to fire, it undergoes several stages of destruction. First, the fire burns away clothing and skin. Then, it begins to affect muscle tissue and organs. Fat in the body can actually fuel the fire, creating what's called the wick effect, where the body's own fat acts like candle wax, feeding the flames. However, even in cases where the wick effect occurs, bones remain. Bones are primarily composed of calcium phosphate, which is extremely resistant to fire. While bones can be damaged by fire, they can crack, break, and become brittle. They don't simply disappear unless subjected to sustained, intense heat. The temperature needs to be well above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained consistently for an extended period. Modern crematoriums operate at temperatures between 1,400 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit and maintain those temperatures for 2 to 3 hours. Even then, recognizable bone fragments remain. These fragments must be mechanically processed, ground down, to create the fine ash that is returned to families. The process of cremation doesn't magically make bones vanish. It breaks them down, but they must then be actively destroyed through mechanical means. A house fire, even a very intense one, typically reaches temperatures of 1,000 to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit at its hottest points. But fires are inconsistent. Different areas of a fire burn at different temperatures. Some parts of a building may be exposed to intense heat, while other parts are exposed to lower temperatures. The fire doesn't burn at peak temperature the entire time. It builds to its maximum intensity and then begins to decline as fuel is consumed. The Sodder house fire burned for approximately 45 minutes to an hour before the structure collapsed. This is not enough time, even under the most intense conditions, to completely destroy 5 human bodies, particularly the bodies of children, which would have been smaller and potentially easier to find remains of, not harder. Dr. Ramsey Amri of Harvard Medical School, consulted about the case in more recent years, stated that bones require consistent temperatures above 850 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 hours to be completely destroyed. The Sodder house fire didn't meet either of these criteria. it likely didn't sustain temperatures above 850 degrees for the majority of its duration, and it burned for less than 1 hour. Jennie Sodder understood this intuitively. Her experiments burning animal bones confirmed what she suspected. Fire doesn't make bones disappear. You can burn an animal carcass, and you'll find bones in the ashes. The fire might damage them, but they'll be there. The scientific evidence strongly suggests that if 5 children had been in the Sodder house when it burned, there should have been remains. The absence of those remains is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence supporting the theory that the children were not in the house when the fire occurred. The phone call and the incendiary device. 2 specific pieces of evidence from the night of the fire deserve special attention because they suggest premeditation and planning rather than a random house fire. The mysterious phone call to Jennie Sodder and the object found on the property that George identified as an incendiary device. The phone call came at 12:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before Jennie first smelled smoke. A woman's voice asked for someone Jennie didn't know. When Jennie said she had the wrong number, the woman laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. Multiple descriptions of this laugh use words like strange, weird, and cackling. In the background, Jennie could hear the sounds of a party, glasses clinking, people laughing and talking. Later investigation determined that the woman who made the call was real, and that it was genuinely a wrong number. However, the timing remains suspicious. 30 minutes before a house fire starts, a phone call wakes the family. Was this coincidence, or was it designed to ensure that George and Jennie were awake when the fire began, increasing the chances they would survive? If the goal was to kidnap the children rather than kill the entire family, then ensuring the parents survived makes a certain twisted sense. Dead parents can't suffer for the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their children. The phone call, whether intentional or coincidental, served to wake Jennie. She then noticed that lights were still on downstairs, unusual because the children normally turned them off, but also potentially useful because it meant Jennie could see as she moved through the house. The incendiary device that Sylvia found months later, when the snow melted, is perhaps even more significant. George Sodder, who had served in World War I, immediately recognized it as resembling a pineapple bomb, a military hand grenade or incendiary device. The object was small, hard, dark green, and made of rubber or a rubber-like substance. This object corresponded with what Jennie had reported hearing about half an hour after the phone call. A loud thump on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, as if something had been thrown onto the roof and then rolled down the slope. The timing fits almost perfectly. The thump and rolling sound, followed shortly by Jennie waking to smell smoke. A witness reported seeing people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house on the night in question. This testimony, combined with the object George found and Jennie's account of the noise on the roof, paints a picture of an incendiary attack rather than an accidental electrical fire. Modern incendiary devices come in many forms. During World War II, various types of fire bombs and incendiary grenades were developed and used. Some were designed to be thrown, others to be launched. They came in different sizes and were filled with various types of accelerants. After the war ended, significant quantities of military hardware and explosives were unaccounted for. Someone with military connections or black market contacts could have obtained incendiary devices. If an incendiary device was thrown onto the Sodder house roof, it would explain several puzzles. Why the fire appeared to start on the roof rather than in the electrical system. Why the Christmas lights remained on when an electrical fire should have killed the power. How the fire spread so quickly through the house. And why the official investigation concluded the fire started in the electrical system near the fuse box when the evidence suggested otherwise. The fire marshal's determination that the fire was caused by faulty wiring has always been questionable. George had recently had the house rewired and professionally inspected. The electrical work had been certified as safe. For it to suddenly fail catastrophically seems unlikely, especially given that the lights were working during the early stages of the fire. The tampering evidence multiple forms of sabotage occurred on the night of the fire, making it nearly impossible for the Sodders to save their children or get help. These acts of sabotage suggest a coordinated plan rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. The ladder that was always kept leaning against the house in the same spot was found 75 feet away at the bottom of an embankment. This wasn't a case of the ladder falling over or being blown by wind. Someone had deliberately moved it and hidden it. The timing is crucial. If the ladder had been moved weeks earlier, George would have noticed and retrieved it. It must have been moved recently, possibly even on the night of the fire itself. George's two trucks, which had been working perfectly earlier that day, both refused to start when he tried to use them. After the fire, both trucks worked fine. Someone had tampered with them in a way that temporarily disabled them, but left no permanent damage. This suggests someone with mechanical knowledge, someone who knew how to sabotage a vehicle in a way that could be quickly reversed. The telephone line had been cut. This wasn't discovered until a telephone repairman came to restore service and examined the line. The cut wasn't at ground level where it might have been accidentally damaged. Someone had climbed the telephone pole, reached out from the pole, and deliberately severed the line. This same sabotage would have affected the neighbors' phones as well, explaining why Marion couldn't call for help from their houses. A man was later arrested for stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property. He confessed to cutting what he thought was a power line, believing it would create a diversion while he committed the theft. However, this explanation doesn't fully account for all the other suspicious circumstances. If this man was simply a thief taking advantage of the fire, it's an incredible coincidence that his theft happened to involve cutting a phone line and removing equipment that could have been used to rescue the children. The water in the rain barrels was frozen solid. This wasn't tampering, it was simply winter weather. But it added to George's inability to fight the fire or help his children. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, at exactly the worst possible time. When you consider all of these factors together, the moved ladder, the disabled trucks, the cut phone line, the timing of the phone call, the incendiary device on the roof, it's extremely difficult to explain them as coincidence. The odds of all of these things happening on the same night, by chance, strain credibility. They suggest planning, coordination, and intent. The witness accounts. The various sightings of the Sodder children in the days, weeks, and years after the fire represent a complex and problematic aspect of the case. Some of these sightings seem credible, others seem more doubtful, but taken together, they created hope for George and Jennie that their children might still be alive. The most immediate sighting came from a woman who lived between the Sodder house and Fayetteville. She reported seeing the 5 Sodder children in a car that drove past her house while the Sodder home was still burning. She was certain of what she saw: 5 children matching the descriptions of the missing Sodders in a car driving away from the scene. This sighting, if accurate, would be powerful evidence that the children were taken rather than killed in the fire. The timing is important. The witness said she saw them while the house was burning, which means they would have been taken early in the fire before it had progressed far enough to make escape impossible. However, there are reasons to question this account. It was the middle of the night, Christmas Eve into Christmas morning. How clearly could the witness have seen the children in a passing car? Was there enough light to make a positive identification? Could she have been certain about what she saw? The witness was never formally identified or interviewed by police in a way that would allow her testimony to be properly evaluated. The sighting at the tourist stop the morning after the fire is more detailed and potentially more credible. A woman working there reported serving breakfast to a group consisting of 4 or 5 children, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. The children looked exactly like the Sodder children. The adults appeared hostile when the woman tried to interact with the children in a friendly way. One of the men looked at her with hostility, then turned and began speaking rapidly in Italian to the others. The group stopped interacting with the woman entirely and left early the next morning. The woman also noted that the group's car had a Florida license plate. This detail is interesting because Jennie Sodder had relatives in Florida, and George had followed up on reports that the children might have been seen there. Could someone in Florida have been involved in taking the children? The Italian-speaking detail is also significant. If the Mafia revenge theory is correct, one would expect the people who took the children to have connections to the Italian immigrant community. The fact that these adults spoke Italian and became hostile when someone tried to interact with the children fits that theory. The Charleston hotel sighting came about a week after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, the hotel operator, claimed to have seen 4 of the 5 Sodder children check in with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction. Like the tourist stop worker, Crutchfield reported that the adults became hostile when she tried to speak with the children. She noted that when she attempted to interact with them in a friendly manner, one of the men looked at her hostilely, turned around, and began talking rapidly in Italian. The whole group then gave her the cold shoulder. Investigators apparently didn't find Crutchfield's story to be credible, though the reasons for this dismissal aren't fully documented. Perhaps they thought she was seeking attention or mistaken about the identification. However, the details of her story are remarkably consistent with the tourist stop sighting: Italian-speaking adults, children matching the Sodders' description, hostile reactions to anyone trying to interact with the children. If these 2 sightings are accurate, they suggest the children were moved from place to place in the days following the fire, always under the control of adults who didn't want anyone speaking with them. This would be consistent with the children being held against their will, possibly being trafficked or moved to a location where they would eventually be placed with other families. Later sightings are more difficult to evaluate. George followed up on reports from St. Louis, Texas, and New York. In each case, the lead went nowhere. Either the children weren't where they were reported to be, or the people who were supposedly the Sodder children turned out to be someone else entirely. The photograph supposedly from Lewis in 1967 represents the most tantalizing potential evidence. If genuine, it would prove that at least one of the children survived and was alive more than 20 years after the fire. The resemblance to Louis is striking, according to those who knew him. The cryptic message on the back suggests someone who wanted to contact the family, but couldn't do so openly. But we can't ignore the possibility that the photograph was a hoax, perhaps perpetrated by someone with a cruel sense of humor, or someone trying to extort money from the grieving family. The fact that the private investigator sent to follow up on this lead disappeared is deeply suspicious, but we don't know what happened to him. He might have taken the Sodders' money and run, never intending to conduct any investigation. Or he might have stumbled onto something real and either been bought off or met with foul play. We simply don't know. What really happened? An assessment. After examining all the evidence, considering all the theories, and analyzing the facts of the case, what can we reasonably conclude about what happened to the Sodder children? The official explanation, that the 5 children died in an accidental house fire caused by faulty wiring and their bodies were completely cremated, is almost certainly incorrect. The forensic evidence doesn't support complete cremation in a fire that burned for less than 1 hour. The fact that household items survived in recognizable form, while 5 complete bodies supposedly vanished without leaving any bones or teeth, is not credible given what we know about how fire affects human remains. The fire itself was most likely arson, not an accident. The combination of witness testimony about balls of fire being thrown at the house, the incendiary device found on the property, George's report of hearing something hit the roof and roll down, and the fact that the fire seemed to start on the roof rather than in the electrical system all point toward deliberate arson rather than an electrical fault. The various acts of sabotage, the moved ladder, the disabled trucks, the cut phone line, further support the conclusion that the fire was a planned attack rather than an accident. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that the Sodders would be unable to save the children or get help quickly. So, if the fire was arson and the children didn't die in it, what happened to them? Here, the evidence becomes more speculative, but three possibilities seem most plausible. Possibility 1. The children were taken before or during the fire. Someone who knew the family and the layout of the house could have convinced or forced the 5 younger children to leave with them. The children, told there was danger or that they needed to go somewhere safe, might have complied. They could have been driven away while the fire was still in its early stages, before George and Jennie realized all the children hadn't made it out. The witness who saw children in a car driving away from the fire would support this scenario. If this is what happened, the subsequent sightings at the tourist stop and Charleston Hotel would represent the children being moved from place to place, under the control of adults who didn't want anyone interacting with them or identifying them. The question then becomes, what was the ultimate fate of the children? Were they sold to other families? Were they taken to Italy or another country? Were they killed later and buried somewhere far from Fayetteville? The photograph supposedly from Louis would suggest that at least one of the children survived to adulthood and was trying to make contact with the family. But if the children were being held or controlled by someone, why would they be allowed or able to send that photograph? And why did only one try to make contact, if indeed the photograph was genuine? Possibility 2. The children died in the fire, but their remains were removed afterward. This would explain both the lack of remains found at the site and the certainty with which George and Jennie believed their children had been taken. Someone involved in the arson, or someone who had access to the site before the official search began, could have removed the bodies to hide evidence of murder or to maintain the mystery about what happened. The problem with this theory is the logistics and timing. The Sodders were present throughout the fire and its aftermath. When would someone have had access to remove the bodies without being seen? Even if the bodies were removed during the confusion of the fire itself, where would they have been taken? And why go to such lengths to remove evidence when the fire itself could have been ruled accidental? Possibility 3. Some combination of the above. Perhaps some of the children died in the fire while others were taken. Perhaps the plan was to take all 5 children, but things went wrong and one or more of them died before they could be removed. The evidence doesn't allow us to know for certain. What about the why, the motivation for this apparent attack on the Sodder family? The Mafia revenge theory remains popular, but it's important to note that this theory has never been proven. There's no documented evidence of Mafia activity in Fayetteville at the time, no direct proof that organized crime was involved. However, George's criticism of Mussolini clearly made him enemies within the Italian immigrant community. The insurance salesman's specific threat that the house would burn and the children would be destroyed as payment for George's dirty remarks about Mussolini cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. Whether or not the Mafia was involved, someone was angry enough at George to threaten his family, and that same person served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. It's possible that the motivation was personal rather than political. A business dispute, a private grudge, something unrelated to George's criticism of Mussolini. The political angle may have been a cover for something else entirely. Or it's possible that the whole thing was about money, human trafficking, child abduction for sale to childless couples, some kind of criminal enterprise that saw opportunity in a large family living in a somewhat isolated location. If this was the motivation, the threats about Mussolini could have been designed to misdirect attention and make George think the attack was politically motivated when it was actually about profit. We simply don't have enough evidence to know with certainty what the motivation was, who was responsible, or what ultimately happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder. Closing. A mystery that endures. 80 years have passed since that terrible Christmas Eve in 1945. All of the principals in the case have now passed away. George Sodder, who spent 24 years searching for his children, died in 1969. Jennie Sodder, who wore black in mourning for the rest of her life, died in 1989. Sylvia Sodder. Paxton, the last survivor of the fire, died in 2021, taking with her the final first-hand memories of that night. If any of the 5 missing children somehow survived, they would be elderly now. Maurice, the oldest, would have turned 94 years old in July of 2025. Betty, the youngest, would have turned 85 in March of 2025. If they are still alive, they may have no memory of being Sodders at all. They may have lived their entire lives under different names, with different families, in different places, never knowing or never being able to acknowledge their true identities. Or perhaps they did not survive long past that Christmas Eve. Perhaps their fate was darker than anyone wants to imagine, and the mystery of their disappearance is simply the mystery of where they are buried, where their remains lie undiscovered after all these decades. The site where the Sodder house once stood is now occupied by a different home. Life continues in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The younger generations who live there today may not remember the billboard that stood along Route 16 for nearly 40 years, showing the faces of 5 lost children and asking what was their fate. But the older residents remember. They remember the Sodder family and the tragedy that befell them. They remember George and Jennie's unending search for answers. The case continues to fascinate new generations of true crime enthusiasts, researchers, and investigators. It has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and television programs. Internet forums dedicated to cold cases regularly discuss the Sodder children. Amateur sleuths propose new theories and analyze the evidence. The case has become one of the iconic unsolved mysteries of American history, alongside cases like the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, the identity of D.B. Cooper, and the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. What makes the Sodder case so compelling? Perhaps it's the combination of elements that seem almost designed to create an enduring mystery. The Christmas Eve timing adds a layer of poignancy. This should have been the happiest night of the year, a time of family gathering and celebration, not tragedy and loss. The fact that 5 children vanished simultaneously, leaving no trace, seems almost impossible, like something out of fiction rather than real life. The dedication of George and Jennie Sodder to finding their children, maintained until the end of their lives, speaks to something fundamental about parental love and the refusal to accept an unacceptable loss. Their billboard became a symbol not just of their tragedy, but of hope. The hope that their children were still alive somewhere, that they might still be found. And perhaps what makes the case most compelling is that we can see in it the limits of what we can know, what we can prove, what we can discover even with decades of investigation and analysis. Despite all the effort that has been put into solving this mystery, we are no closer to definitive answers today than the Sodders were in 1945. The case raises uncomfortable questions about justice and closure. The official investigation concluded within days that the fire was accidental and the children were dead. Case closed. But the evidence suggests otherwise, and the family was right to question the official narrative. Yet their decades of investigation, their enormous expenditure of time and money and emotional energy led nowhere. If there was a conspiracy, it succeeded. If crimes were committed, the perpetrators were never caught. If the children were taken, they were never found. This is the reality of many unsolved cases. The truth exists somewhere, known to someone, but it remains hidden. Evidence is lost or destroyed. Witnesses die or remain silent. Time passes, and memory fades. The window for solving a case eventually closes, and what was once a pressing investigation becomes a historical curiosity. But for those who lived through it, for the Sodder family and their descendants, this is not ancient history. This is their family. These were real children. Maurice, who was 14 years old and helped his father with the family business. Martha, who was 12 and loved playing with the toys her sister Marion had bought her. Louis, who was 9 and did his evening chores taking care of the family's animals. Jennie, who was 8 and named after her mother. And little Betty, who was only 5 years old and just beginning to understand the world around her. These 5 children had personalities and dreams and futures ahead of them. They were loved by their parents and siblings. They should have grown up, attended high school, fallen in love, had careers and families of their own. Instead, they vanished on Christmas Eve in 1945, and their fate remains one of America's most haunting mysteries. The question that remains. As we conclude this journey into one of America's most perplexing mysteries, we return to the question that George and Jennie Sodder asked on their billboard, the question they posed to everyone who passed by for nearly 40 years. What was their fate? Were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder murdered by those who set fire to their home? Were they taken and held somewhere, raised by other families, living under assumed identities? Did they survive to adulthood, perhaps even to old age, somewhere in the world? Or did they perish that Christmas Eve in a way we may never understand? The truth is, we don't know. We may never know. The mystery of the Sodder children endures not because we lack theories or explanations, but because we lack proof. We can analyze the evidence, weigh the possibilities, and construct elaborate scenarios, but at the end of the day, we cannot say with certainty what happened to those 5 children. What we do know is this: George and Jennie Sodder lost 5 of their children on Christmas Eve in 1945, under circumstances that were never adequately explained. They spent the rest of their lives searching for answers, never giving up hope, never accepting the official story that their children had died in an accidental fire. They believed their children were taken from them, and they devoted themselves to finding them, or at least discovering the truth about what happened. Their story is, in many ways, the story of every parent who has lost a child to mysterious circumstances. It's a story about love and loss, about the refusal to let go, about the human need for answers and closure. It's a story about how we cope, or fail to cope, with tragedy that makes no sense, with grief that has no resolution. The faces of those 5 children, frozen in time in the photographs on the Sodder billboard, looking out at passing travelers for decades, remind us that behind every unsolved mystery are real people whose lives were cut short or irrevocably changed. They remind us that justice delayed is often justice denied, that truth is not always discoverable, and that some questions may echo through generations without ever receiving an answer. And so the mystery endures. Somewhere, the truth of what happened to the Sodder children exists. It may exist only in old memories that are fading with age. It may exist in documents that have been lost or destroyed. It may exist in secrets taken to graves decades ago. Or it may exist in the hearts of those who know but have never spoken, who carry knowledge they have never shared. Until, or unless, that truth emerges, we are left with questions, theories, and the haunting images of 5 children who vanished on Christmas Eve 1945, leaving behind grieving parents, bereft siblings, and a mystery that has captivated the nation for 8 decades. What was their fate? We may never know, but we can remember them, and we can remember the family that never stopped searching for them. That, at least, we can do. For the channel Lore to Sleep 2, we've journeyed through one of the most mysterious and heartbreaking cases in American history. The disappearance of the Sodder children reminds us that not all mysteries have tidy solutions, that real life doesn't always provide the closure we crave. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps in the comfort and safety of your own home, spare a thought for George and Jennie Sodder, who spent every Christmas for the rest of their lives wondering where their children were. Think of Sylvia Sodder Paxton, who never forgot her missing siblings and spent her entire life believing they had somehow survived that terrible night. And remember, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, 5 children who should have grown old, who should have had long and happy lives, but who instead became symbols of one of America's most enduring, unsolved mysteries. Their story is our story in some ways, a reminder that life is precious and fragile, that we should cherish the time we have with those we love, and that some questions may remain forever unanswered. Sleep well and hold your loved ones close. You never know when an ordinary night might become extraordinary, for better or for worse. Good night from Lord Mystery.